The Way In. Episode 1. Pressure Points. People think murder begins with rage. It doesn't. It begins with pressure. Not the kind you can see, not shouting, not violence, not even hatred. Pressure is quieter than that. First, it builds behind the eyes, then in the chest. You can detect them in the small pauses before someone answers a simple question. I've spent most of my life studying pressure. When I worked for the Bureau, they wanted patterns. They wanted escalation charts and behavioral clusters. They wanted monsters with predictable trajectories. They believed violence was an event. I learned it was erosion. My name is Nathaniel Robbins, and long before anyone called me disgraced, I understood something they didn't. A person doesn't break because they're evil. They break when the story they tell about themselves can no longer survive reality. That is when the fracture begins. And fracture is everything. His name, Daniel Hargrove, 43, financial analyst, married, 2 children, suburban house with pale siding and a swing set in the yard. I was amused by how vanilla his life seemed. If you saw him at a grocery store, you would not look twice. Daniel came into my awareness because of a regulatory filing, a mid-level corporate fraud investigation. His name was buried 3 pages deep in a public disclosure. Most people would never read that far. But I did. Daniel wasn't the architect of the fraud. He wasn't even central. He was what corporations like to call a compliance intermediary, a man who signed things, approved things, looked away from things. The perfect fall guy. For 6 years he signed, and then an audit that evolved into an investigation took place, and the garbage came bubbling to the surface as it always does. Daniel was now in the investigator's crosshairs. When I first heard his voice, it wasn't in a session. It was in a recorded deposition, public record, calm, measured, careful. But there was a tremor. He paused too long before answering direct questions. He corrected himself mid-sentence. He used the phrase, "to the best of my recollection," 5 times in under 10 minutes. That phrase always interests me. Memory is the first thing people use as a shield of sorts when really they unknowingly weaponize it against themselves. Daniel eventually sought professional help. And although I could have inserted myself into the situation at this point to get a better lay of the land, I thought it best to keep my distance in order to remain anonymous. I have to be careful as to not leave breadcrumbs for my peers. My understanding of the human psyche gives me an advantage so that I can conduct my business in the shadows, something I learned as a forensic psychologist during my time at the FBI. He found a therapist on his own, a crisis counselor after the internal audit began. For the life of me, I didn't understand why he sought counseling from a crisis specialist. Perhaps he was forced to go by the company to make him look unstable. Either way, it just gave me more to work with. People think collapse begins when consequences arrive. It doesn't. It begins when isolation slowly creeps in. Daniel stopped sleeping. That was the first sign. Then he stopped eating regularly. Eventually, he stopped making eye contact during conversations. These details are not difficult to obtain. After all, I'm connected to everything. You would be surprised what people make visible when they are unraveling. He told his therapist, "I don't feel like myself. That sentence is a threshold marker. When someone says they don't feel like themselves, what they actually mean is this: the version of me I believed in is no longer sustainable. And when identity destabilizes, something opens. The emails began 2 days later. Anonymous disclosures to the company's board, internal inconsistencies flagged, financial irregularities surfaced for review. I did not accuse him. I insinuated. I did not threaten him. At least not directly. I did not tell him what to do, because that would create a connection to me, and I couldn't have that. Pressure does not require that kind of aggression. It requires surgical precision. Daniel began receiving calls from compliance officers, then from legal, and later from a journalist who had been tipped off about a possible testimony from a whistleblower. He told his therapist he felt like he was splitting. That was the word he used. Splitting. As if there were two versions of him. One who had signed the documents, and one who had convinced himself it didn't matter. When those versions begin to conflict, the mind looks for relief. Relief can take many forms: confession, denial, violence, or surrender. The night before he was scheduled to testify, Daniel called his therapist at 11:42 p.m. I know the exact time because he left a voicemail. I don't know who I am anymore, he said frantically. His voice sounded disconnected and paranoid. There is a particular quality to the voice when identity destabilizes. It loses ownership. Words sound borrowed. He described an instance where he had stood in front of his bathroom mirror, and everything felt delayed, as if his reflection responded half a second too late. He laughed when he described it. I too laughed at this. People often laugh at the edge of collapse. It feels safer than silence. He said, "If I tell the truth, I destroy my family. But if I lie, I risk destroying myself." That is not a moral dilemma. That is an identity rupture. And rupture is proximity. There is a moment, it does not last long, when distance becomes irrelevant. When a person's internal narrative fractures so completely that the boundary between thought and action thins. Professionals would call it dissociation. Some would call it shock. You would call it stress. And you would not be entirely wrong. But those words are insufficient to describe what's really happening. Daniel stood in that bathroom and said out loud, "I don't recognize myself." The threshold I mentioned earlier was now open space. And at that threshold, a breach had occurred. He was no longer alone. The next morning, Daniel woke up on his living room floor. The television was on. A news anchor was speaking in the careful tone reserved for sudden violence, but yet upbeat, something I despised about the media. A key witness in the Bellamy Holdings case had been found dead late the previous night, shot once, clean, close range. Daniel did not remember leaving his house, but why should he be thinking that to himself? It's not like he had any reason to believe he had done something. Or did he? He was still in the same clothes he had on the day before, but on the cuff of his Oxford button-down, he caught a glimpse of something. Was that blood spatter? Just a couple of faint dots. Now his mind was reeling. What did he do last night? Memory is unreliable under stress. The brain protects itself. He told investigators he had been home all night, but he had no viable alibi. His wife and kids left when the investigation started because he thought it would be best to get them away from the potential of prying eyes and increased attention if the case started going sideways. Luckily for him, there was no evidence left at the scene. There rarely is. He sat in an interrogation room 2 days later and repeated, "I don't know what happened." And in a way, that was true. When a person fractures, they experience the aftermath as absence, missing time, gaps, a sense of watching themselves from a distance. Daniel would later describe the night as a blur. That word amuses me. A blur implies motion. The truth is quieter. It is not chaos, it is not rage, it is not frenzy, it is alignment. When a mind stops resisting, when doubt overtakes narrative, when the boundary softens, that is the way in. You may wonder if I feel guilt. Guilt requires ownership. Daniel made choices long before I ever set my sights on him. He signed documents, he concealed information, he told himself stories about necessity. I did not create his fracture. I recognized it. And I took advantage of it with a small push. There is a difference. Most people spend their lives avoiding the parts of themselves they do not wish to see. I study those parts, and I have for longer than I can remember. It requires a skill that no regular person possesses. Most of all, it requires patience. I wait for the 3 V's to align, the moment they become visible, vulnerable, and vacant. Because when a person says, "I don't know who I am anymore," what they are really saying is, "I am open." And that vacancy is an invitation. There are thresholds in the human mind. Thresholds of doors most people never notice. Doors that only appear under pressure. You do not need to break them down. You only need to know when they begin to open. Daniel was not the first. He will not be the last. Pressure builds everywhere. Behind polished reputations, behind family portraits, behind sworn testimony, most fractures go unnoticed. But for some of us, those with the power of second sight, they are hard to miss. And once you understand the structure of the mind and how it fractures, once you understand the moment identity dissolves, you realize something very simple. Distance is irrelevant. I can almost hear the doors unlock and creak open. It is my gift. And the mind, the human mind, under enough pressure, it isn't a cold wind that blows the door to it open. It is me picking a broken lock, broken by weakness of one and the will of another. That is the way in.